As president of the Chevy Chase Historical Society, I'm pleased to introduce former CCHS Director Gail Sansbury. Gail worked at the Archive and Research Center from 2012 to 2016 after retiring from teaching and relocating with her husband from California to Washington, D.C. She has a master's degree in both American history and urban planning, and a PhD in planning from UCLA. And now Gail Sansbury will share her extensive research on landscape architect Nathan Barrett. Gail?
Thank you, Susan, so much. I'm sorry, that a little glitch there. And thank you to all my friends from CCHS and from everyone attending the Zoom call tonight. Let me get started. The elusive Mr. Barrett. That's what this is all about. Where are his papers and plans? And my curiosity about this began when I was working at the CCHS archives. I had the opportunity to look at some of Nathan Barrett's plans at Chevy Chase. I recommend you taking a look at them sometime too, if you're interested. It's not a large collection, but it turns out that it actually might be the largest group of his papers that we know of. So since I wanted to know more about Barrett, I thought it might be a good idea to create a catalog of his landscape work. Now, I want to just say that I am not trained as a landscape architect. So while working on this project, I depended on the work of many others, and it was so interesting to me. Finally, I want to say how lucky I am to have family and friends who have helped me over the years and cheered me on. Thank you so much.
Here's the page down.
So let's start out where Nathan Barrett was born in Staten Island in 1845. His family came from Maine, his father's side, and his mother was English, and they lived in this area around that circle up there, a kind of a highland part of Staten Island. John Barrett, his father, moved to Staten Island to work for his uncle, Nathan Barrett. And by the way, the Barrett family has many people named Nathan Barrett. But working for Nathan Barrett, John Barrett worked his way up into the New York Dyeing and Printing Company and made his life there. The circle on the map, as I said, is where the family is. And now I'm going to take this is the New York dyeing and printing establishment that so many of the Barrett family were associated with. And later on, it was known as Barrett and Nephews. But I show it here primarily because his uncle actually developed housing for workers for this factory. And perhaps Nathan Barrett remembered this when he planned the town of Pullman. Barrett left school at 16, and he decided that he would serve before the mast. So he left New York for Liverpool on a large ship called the Escort. But it didn't actually suit him. When he returned to Staten Island, he wasn't sure what he would do. He spent the summer at his family's home, and he was, in his own words, boy-like, quite undecided as to my future. At some point, perhaps by his parents' persuasion, Barrett went to work alongside his older brother, Clarence, who was working on the nursery that their father had established some time ago, about 30 acres. And you can see the nursery of J.T. Barrett here within that circle. Daniel Regan was an Irish gardener who worked at large estates in Ireland before coming to New York. And he encouraged Barrett to read books about landscape design. In Barrett's 1916 memoir, he speaks of reading Andrew Jackson Downing and the work of Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted. But in 1862, Barrett joined the Union Army, just as his older brother had as well. And he served in the 156th Regiment. At first, they were sent to Mississippi, but his regiment came back to Washington, D.C. Briefly. And I think it's interesting that his parents traveled from Staten Island to visit him in Washington, D.C. Well, shortly after this visit, his regiment set off towards the Shenandoah. He was injured in that famous Battle of Cedar Creek. One of his arms was hurt, but he recovered quickly and he returned to his regiment and he mustered out in 1865 as a colonel. He returned home to work with his brother. His first plan, as he writes in his memoir, was a small plot in Bergen Point, New Jersey. On June 6, 1869, Barrett and Lucy Mildred Lampkin received a marriage license in Athens, Georgia. Now, I don't know how they met, but Mildred, she preferred Mildred rather than Lucy, was a daughter of Terrell Lampkin and America Adams. The family lived in Athens, where her father was a co-owner and editor of the Southern Whig before the Civil War. Her father was not well at the end of the war, and he died there in 1867. Nathan and Mildred's first child was born in 1870. She gave birth to 8 children, but only 2 survived to adulthood: Alice Irene Barrett and John Terrell Barrett. If you look closely at that the plan on the upper left, you'll see that there's an N.F. Barrett house for on the family homestead there. Now, when Barrett was working for his older brother Clarence, there were some receipts that show what he did. I mean, he worked on lots of different projects, but under Clarence supervision. In one project, he actually made $25 for planting lots and lots of trees for Mr. Hamilton Salmon. From 1871 to 1876, Barrett and Clarence Barrett, his brother, improved, quote, the landscape around the new railroads that were owned by the New Jersey Central Railroad and the Long Branch Division. Now, railroads, large and small, were a key element in many of Barrett's later projects. In this slide, you see a pamphlet about new homes conveniently near the new railroad station. And note the very curvy street plan for one of these developments adjacent to Fanwood Park. Writers made money writing these guidebooks for these new developments. Gustav Kobe wasn't very kind about the new town of Roselle, suggesting that it had no history. I can't believe that, but he did give a shout out to the Barrett brothers' work on the station grounds. Now, on January 1st, 1878, Barrett decided to stop working with his brother. He writes, "I severed my connection with my brother, and since then I have been engaged in treating a great variety of work." Well, later on that year, Barrett actually met George M. Pullman, who hired him to landscape his country house called Fairlawn in Elberon, New Jersey. In addition to planting the gardens at this seaside villa, Pullman helped Barrett to get a job of laying out the whole town of Elberon. Barrett suggested Solon Beeman for some of the work at Elberon, but Pullman liked them both so much he asked them to come to Chicago and discuss his plans for what would become the town of Pullman. And after their visit, they began frantically working on their plans. A team was put together. Of course, it included Barrett as the landscape architect, Beeman as the architect, and civil engineer W.F. Sargent, and sanitary engineer Benezet Williams. But Barrett did not stay in Chicago as his other colleagues did. He had a young family, of course, and he also had other jobs. He did return from time to time. A young engineer, Bremer Pond, remembered how happy everyone was to see Barrett when he came back to Pullman. Here's a quote from what he wrote. His visits, long or short, were always joyful periods, for Barrett was a good sport and a bon vivant. So Barrett has spoken about his relationship with Pullman. He wrote in his memoir that from 1879 until the death of Pullman, his relations with him were most intimate. As well known, he was one of the groups of men who made history in the commercial development of the land. It is my hope to write his life from my standpoint. I don't think that Barrett was able to do that, but he was very influenced by Mr. Pullman's ideas. So here you see some of the landscaping of Barrett's work, the arcade park and the arcade building in the distance as well. Richard Ely, in a famous article in the Harper's Monthly, talked about Mr. Pullman's ideas, and he uses this term, the commercial value of beauty. This is what Pullman thought was the best way to make money, basically. And here you see a photo of Barrett and Beeman in 1890, when publicity shots like this were still welcome, right? But in the famous photo below of the Pullman strike in 1894, you see another view. Progressives were confounded by Pullman's refusal to rescind his job cuts and increased rent for those who were living in Pullman town just because of the downturn in the economy. Jane Addams was one of those Pullman critics. But on a lighter side, Barrett was very interested in athletics. This is a period when organizations like the YWCA were pushing for manly men. And it also is important because of a sense of their work in the after the Civil War. So Barrett was an avid sportsman. He played both he planned both a playground and an athletic island at the edge of Lake Calumet. The idea was that workers in Pullman would benefit from these values. Apparently, only a few of the workers actually participated. But a news clip from 1882 describes one of the first days of the use of the athletic center there. The headline was "Jollification," with all kinds of sporting contests. Back home in New York, Barrett continued his practice. He planned the landscape for H.C. Petter's new house in Llewellyn Park. And you may already know that Llewellyn Park was one of the earliest planned developments in the US. But Petter was later charged for embezzling at his firm, and the company eventually sold the house to Thomas Edison and his wife in 1886. In 1907, they hired another landscape architect, Ernest Bowditch, to make some changes. However, according to the Park Service, which manages this property now, much of Barrett's work still remains. Barrett considered his work at Dunmere, the home of Robert Graham Dunn in Narragansett, Rhode Island, one of his most important projects, in part because he combined formal gardens while preserving the rocky terrain. Newspapers at the time described a man-made pool and a special dock for catching bass. In 1883, Barrett traveled to Atlanta and he talked with the Peters Park Improvement Company about a plan that they were developing. They actually selected Barrett as their landscape designer for their proposed residential development on land belonging to Richard Peters, one of the company's investors. One of the other principals was Hannibal Ingalls Kimball, who had built a large hotel in Atlanta after the war. Kimball was a friend of Pullman, so perhaps that was the connection. The prospectus was printed and the investors made plans for the auction of this exclusive development, but at the very last minute, one of their funders backed out, one that they really depended on, and this plan was never realized. However, the sales map, having already been printed, is quite interesting. No, it was a blow for Barrett that this didn't go forward. It appears that he was paid for his early work in doing the infrastructure. And Barrett's plans here are quite interesting. However, mostly because he seemed to have put almost everything into this plan. So many different elements of landscape, I must say. A lot going on. Grand avenues, formal entrances, playgrounds, parks, athletic tracks with a baseball ground, and a grandstand, and to top it off, an Italian plaisance. You can see his plan for this here. He created something that was kind of unusual, as sort of a raised platform that crosses one of the curvilinear streets in the park. It's quite like some of his later work that I hope to be able to show you. Well, the good news about this project, though, is that in 1885, the Georgia School of Technology, now known as Georgia Tech, was founded, and it's on the same site. In this screenshot, you can see the curving roadway in the center, an artifact of Barrett's plan. And just below, there's a field and a stadium. I'm sure Mr. Barrett would have been pleased about that. Well, back to the north, one of Barrett's best-known country houses is Namke, built for the Choate family in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. This view shows part of Barrett's formal garden, looking west to the Berkshires. There's a story about how Barrett got this job. The Choates first spoke with Olmsted Sr., but he advised them to cut down an old tree in order to accommodate a house that would sit just below the hilltop. But they had shared many picnics under this same tree, and they didn't want to cut it down. Well, Barrett had a different idea. And so with their architect, Stanford White, the house was built on higher ground, and the tree survived. So you can see the tree at the bottom there in the middle. You have to notice that there's actual people standing there to get the sense of what a large tree it was. Here's one other element of Barrett's connection with the Choates. They are related to this plan that Barrett wrote by hand, I believe, it's sort of a sketch for a proposed residential community. He shows 17 cottages plus a lot of room for lacrosse, cricket, baseball, tennis, archery, and croquet. Well, the plan was never realized, but it's an interesting example of Barrett's interest in athletics. In 1885, Barrett designed the plan for Rochelle Park in New Rochelle, New York. And in 1888, he actually moved his family there. But his plan, he describes in his memoir as half-acre plots on a formal avenue of 100 feet in width and curvilinear drives. He says that they express the two schools of landscape art, the formal and the picturesque. What happened is that Barrett convinced the Manhattan Life Insurance Company to pay a little bit more so that they could get a greater return on their investment. And they followed Barrett's ideas. Again, this sounds very much like George Pullman's view of the world. Note on the upper right, there's a tiny square. That's Barrett's house. He got a house. He had to build his house, but that was part of his contract. Barrett liked to have parties of all sorts, and of course athletic events too, especially for children. Things like three-legged races and things like that. But also his friends from the Sculpture Society came to his house many times, and there were benefits for various causes, such as the veterans of New Rochelle. The newspaper covering these events, covered these events, and in particular, the one for the veterans of New Rochelle, it's quite interesting. And they write how Miss Hilda Carling performed a dance in a filmy Greek garment and bare limbs. Goodness. Barrett's house, you see here in the upper left, and then in the other images, a variety of flowers and shrubs and trees around his house. In the summer, a cellar walkway planned on a diagonal, he called it the midway, gave access to cooler temperatures. And he had a tea house up above the garden. It was a really wonderful place, and many people photographed it, and he was very happy about that. In 1885 and through to 1888, Barrett worked with Carrere and Hastings on the Hotel Ponce de Leon for the extremely wealthy Henry Flagler. Although Carrere and Hastings' plans for the hotel are carefully kept in an archive in Florida, there doesn't seem to be any information there about Barrett's landscaping for the project. And yet when you read the contemporary newspapers of that time, there was so much interest in the tropical gardens that Barrett made. Well, sadly, after some years of not being well, I suppose, Mildred Barrett died in May 30th, 1886, and she's buried in Staten Island. Barrett carried on, of course, because he had still young children, and he had to work all the time, apparently. This particular project, though, for Edward Dean Adams, a wealthy investor, it is quite a surprise, and it links to his Barrett's interest in sculpture. He was a great lover of sculpture. Adams hired Stanford White and Barrett, and he asked them to have a fountain on his very large property, 64 acres. White and Barrett commissioned Frederick McMonnies, a well-known sculptor in that time. And the sculpture that he brought to them was called Pan of Rohalion, and you can see that in the little picture there on the right. And it actually sparked a fad in the following years. Both large and small reproductions were made, and many museums have of those as well. In 1887, Barrett married Clara Adele Weiss. She was an opera singer, a soprano, and the New York newspapers noted her various recitals, but we don't really know that much about her. In 1887, Barrett began traveling quite a lot. He traveled to North Fort Worth, Texas, and he laid out a plan for a new neighborhood adjacent to Fort Worth. The 2,500-acre site included a park, a boulevard, a grand avenue that curves around an existing cemetery on the bluff overlooking the Trinity River. To connect the grid, Barrett rotated the North Fort Worth grid just slightly, but in a way that worked out very well. Also in this period, Barrett planned an industrial development in another section of Texas, and it was called New Birmingham. Unfortunately, that development failed quite quickly, but Barrett traveled a lot. And while he was in the West, perhaps during this same time, it seems that he may have met with Francis Newlands, either in California or Nevada. In 1889, a newspaper in Reno suggests that a New York landscape gardener would be coming to plan the landscape of Newland's new home on the bluffs overlooking the Truckee River. The current owners of the home have found other clues as well, especially Barrett's use of shrubs and trees, and in this case, 100 trees. Well, here we come to Chevy Chase, because by this time, Barrett knows Newlands well. So between 1890 and 1892, Barrett works with Philadelphia architect Lindley Johnson and others to prepare this exclusive development. But I want to look more closely, not at the whole program of Chevy Chase, but at just the Magnolia Parkway area that intersects with the Chevy Chase Circle. And so here's a planting plan that he must have developed to leave for workers to do this when he was away. And it specifies the walkways and shrubs and trees and the use of boxwood, a very good choice to suggest the very fancy new development. It takes a long time for boxwood to grow, of course, and the Chevy Chase Land Company paid for a greenhouse and nursery as part of Barrett's work. Whatever flowers and plants were left over were sold at the flower market at downtown. This was in 1893, however. Nathan Barrett also prepared plans and sketches for Francis Newlands in the District of Columbia. Newlands had recently bought Oak View, President Cleveland's home, and you may recognize the street plan here. Barrett drew over what seems to be the real estate plan, and it looks like he was interested in the possibility of vistas looking out over the District of Columbia. There are a number of these projects at the Historical Society, and none of them were adopted. But this was still Barrett's project, Chevy Chase, this picturesque landscape that he developed. One last thing, though, it's a story about Barrett and Newlands and Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. Newlands corresponded with Olmsted about the street plans in the District of Columbia, and he wanted Olmsted to provide an argument to move away from the existing grid. At one point in their correspondence, Newlands suggests that Olmsted might also consult with Barrett and his plans for Chevy Chase. Olmsted's reply is curt, but to me, quite reasonable. He says, Mr. Barrett must have long ago settled down upon a general theory of design as the basis of the plan he has furnished. We do not think our ideas could be well drafted onto his stock. Well, it's a strangely old-fashioned way of speaking, but definitely I agree with him. However, I do not know if Barrett knew of these conversations, and if he did, how he might have felt. Now we go to Maine, Grindstone Neck, Winter Harbor. Barrett and Lindley Johnson worked together on this project for the Goldsboro Land Improvement Company, which was led by wealthy Philadelphia residents. So perhaps Johnson, who was from Philadelphia, perhaps that's how they got this project. Their idea was modeled on Tuxedo and also partly Llewellyn Park. Johnson designed the hotel and club house and several houses, and Barrett was responsible for the landscape plan. Barrett's plan preserved much of the existing rocks and trees. He added some dry stone walls and terraces and retaining walls, but he really left it alone. Here's part of what he said in his proposal. By my plan, two well-known styles in the art of landscape, the severe or artificial, and the rough, weird, and picturesque, could be and would be combined. And the unusual natural topography availed of to its best advantage. Here is the garden, the formal garden of the main entrance to the hotel that Lindley Johnson designed. But on the west side of the hotel, Barrett kept a wilder plan, as you can see, retaining the rocks and the low-growing plantings. Well, here's a little bit of Grindstone Neck today. Lindley Johnson actually built a house for himself in the chalet style, and it's still there, as you see on the upper right. Barrett didn't seem to have purchased a lot, but he may have something even better. He has a street named after him. Barrett went back to Alabama in the South in 1890 to work for the Decatur Land Improvement and Furnace Company. He was originally hired in 1888, but the work began much later. His plan included the development of new streets, alleys, and parks, and his colleague, Colonel George E. Waring, Jr., a leading sanitary engineer, designed a system of drainage and sewerage. Altogether, they laid out more than 500 acres of land for streets and alleys and 100 acres for parks. Barrett planned the Delano Park, shown here, and you can see that's marked with green here. And you note the serpentine street that makes its way across the grid in this project. Well, a year or so later, Barrett corresponded, as I think he did a number of times, with George Pullman about a landscape plan at the Pullman's home on Prairie Avenue. But I like to see these three letters, well, actually one is a sketch, because we don't have much in Barrett's handwriting. These are held at the Newberry Library in Chicago. Most interesting is Barrett's mention in one of the letters that he was working day and night to finish projects before the ground freezes, and he's hoping to make enough money to live over the winter. He was not a great businessman, and so he probably always worked along the edge of everything. However, he loved so many things about working with other people. And so he participated in many flower shows and events. So in 1891, Barrett and the architect John Russell Pope created this really exciting and over-the-top flower show at the Waldorf Astoria. They actually created this over a single night, but people were just mad about it. They thought it was wonderful. And in 1895, Barrett convinced the Sculpture Society to have their annual exhibit in the Fine Arts Society, but with plants and trees, something very new. Barrett and architect Thomas Hastings designed it, and it was very successful. One of Barrett's favorite projects, but also bittersweet, was working for the Essex County Park Commission, especially on Branch Brook Park in Newark, New Jersey. In 1895, Barrett and John Bogart were chosen to develop plans for what would become the first county-wide park system in the nation. Unfortunately, they didn't get to work on the county-wide part of it, but they had each submitted proposals in the initial round, but the commissioners asked them to work together. And they began by clearing land in what would be called the Southern District of Branch Brook Park. There were 3 sections. However, there's a little background here. In 1867, Olmsted and Vox and Company prepared a report for the county about how to have a park in this area, and they had presented it in Newark. For some reason, I believe, and others as well, that the Olmsted brothers perhaps thought that they had already gotten the job and that they shouldn't have to share all the information and funding and all of that that they would normally do in a proposal. They were left out, and Barrett and Bogart were moving forward. However, Barrett and Bogart had a hard time as well. Some of the commissioners felt that they were spending way too much money as they prepared the landscape, which was with parts of industrial areas and things like that. And some of the commissioners did not like Barrett's flowery landscape plans as well. So after working for them for several years, but year to year, they were replaced by the Olmsted brothers, who then eventually came and worked on the other 2 parts of the program. Still, Barrett thought that the idea of a county-wide park system was a really good idea. And here's some of the his floral displays, but much later, of course. He didn't have any, he didn't do that gardening at that point. Now we turn to a really kind of amazing house in a very strange way, the home of P.A.B. Widener. And the house is called Linwood Hall. And the architect was Horace Trumbauer. It's a huge house and had 100 rooms, but those many rooms were essential to Widener because he, as you all may know, was a great art collector. He made his money as a streetcar magnate, though. And here's a plan by Trumbauer, and I'm thinking that would be the same one that Barrett worked off, but Trumbauer was also very involved with the landscaping as well. A photo of one of the fountains there was shown at an exhibit at the T-Square Society in Philadelphia, and it just shows that this wild torrent of water Well, now we come to the first meeting of the ASLA, the American Society of Landscape Architects. Of the 11 people who showed up, Barrett was one of them. They came together and at first they met just a few times a year, but Barrett was quite active and sharing his plans of the work that he was doing, and he was also really interested in a program that actually the Olmsted worked more on than he did, but it was something that he was really concerned about, which was what happens when you have a bad client. Barrett had many bad clients, and he had had to sue for several of his clients. I wish there were more time to talk about this, but I don't think that tonight we want to look at all these documents. However, it was a very important part of the sort of evolution of becoming a professional organization. So in 1900, Barrett began work on the Auchincloss Sunken Garden in Newport. Not many people know that, but at any rate, there was an article in the New York Herald, and Barrett described what his approach was for creating this sunken garden. He'd been told by people who lived in Newport, Seth Lowe and Agassiz, that they tried to have trees, but the wind wouldn't let them grow. But Mr. Barrett said, however, he solved that problem. The lay of the land allowed him to sink the formal garden 15 feet, and this depression he utilized as a lee for the trees, planting second growth trees in a great variety in the banks of this garden. Then he surrounded the formal garden with a wild one from which you peep down into. My goodness. So here are some of the photos in black and white, and in a minute in color. These were taken by Francis Benjamin Johnson, and you can find them in the Library of Congress. So here's the later view form of this garden that he developed. It took so many people to take care of this, however, and later on, the Auchinclosses, much later, actually had the Olmsted brothers fill most of it in. And yes, Jackie and her husband were married here, and she spent time here as a young woman. Well, there were growing concerns about the quarries removing trap rock from the Palisades along the Hudson River. And in fact, the first meetings of the ASLA were many people were talking about this and sending letters to Albany about how to try to stop the quarries. It's a hard problem because actually the rock was being used to build all the buildings in New York City, but nevertheless, mind that, it turned into a large movement, and in the end there was a commission developed. Barrett was very proud that he was appointed to this from both from the New York side of the Hudson River and the New Jersey side, and he was reelected in this work many times and followed it until 1915. At the end of his life, I don't really know, well, Barrett, let me start again. Barrett, we don't really know what his exact duties were because it's been hard to find the documents. especially during COVID, but they were probably related to landscape considerations, pathways, walkways, things like that. But at the end of his life, it's been said that he was very concerned about the impact of motorists, and so was the commission. So that might have been where that came from. But long before his death, Barrett took a great trip to the General Federation of Women's Clubs biennial in Los Angeles. He went with his wife, and many good things were said about him. He was very proud to have been chosen to be on a panel. And I'm going to just skip forward so that I don't get too far behind here. But as you go away for a long visit like that, well, then you want to meet your friends. And one of Barrett's friends was a artist from New York, Paul DeLongre, and DeLongre introduced Barrett and to his to Laughlin, Homer Laughlin, the person who's so well known for his pottery. He retired from that, but at any rate, this meeting turned into a driving tour around Los Angeles, ending in Laughlin's recently purchased property near Los Feliz, if you know Los Angeles. And after walking around the property, maybe for an hour or so or something, Barrett discussed a plan with Laughlin right away, and he got the job. So Barrett worked with Laughlin for 8 years. Later, the park actually, became a planned development that the Laughlin children decided to do, and it became a place where many people in the motion picture business lived and still do, no doubt. But Barrett's talk at the biennial, his whole reason for going there, is a little interesting in the sense that he was actually unable to give the talk. Now, this might be because of his illness. He had throat cancer. But what happened is that someone else read for him, and then it was published in the Los Angeles Times. Four little interesting things about it. He talked a lot about public landscapes and how important it was for Essex County and states and the whole nation to preserve landscapes. He only spoke a bit about one of his wealthy clients, but I know the family is surely the Mortimer family who lived on Long Island. There were young people who worked with Barrett on their vast home on many projects. The other thing is that were in his talk were about lawns and the ups and downs of the whole lawn progress. He's sort of against lawns in some places. And at the end of his talk, he declares that Los Angeles has a problem, and the problem is its landscape is too luxurious. Mr. Barrett, he's a very funny guy. Well, shortly after that, he also donated his services to the West Brighton Actors Home in Staten Island, not far from where he grew up. He was always an advocate of the actors, and he designed the landscape there, and that's an entryway that he also designed for them. In 1903, Barrett was the president of the ASA, and I'm sad to say that there's very little that we know about Barrett's work while he was president. I think he spoke at many organizations and things like that, but there's no papers in that sense, it's sort of a mystery. In 1916, he published his memoir, and he talks here in it about one of his clients kind of ridiculing the idea that he lived by his imagination. And Barrett responded by saying that he thought that many a man, and we should say women as well, had who worked by their imagination had lived longer than men of large bank accounts. So that was Barrett's take on that. I think he was running out of money, and because he wasn't well. And he advertised a school of landscape architecture, but I don't know who might have participated in that program at all. And in fact, the next year in 1919, the Barretts actually sold their home back to the Manhattan life insurance company, and they moved to a smaller home in Pelham, New York. Sadly, in October 1919, just before he was supposed to have surgery, he died from his throat cancer. He left his wife, Clara, and his two children, Nathan and Clarabelle, and his son from his first marriage, John Terrell Barrett. I went to see his graveyard, and I noticed that he is very close to the actors area. There's a whole group of graveyards specifically for actors, and I found that quite nice because, of course, he was a great proponent of all the arts. So there you are, Nathan Barrett. So much more to find out about him. The gardener, the engineer, the architect, the modeler, and the artist. But he was also that bon vivant, and he was also a great storyteller. He was a patron of the arts and an advocate for sports, public parks, and preservation. So I hope if you're interested in any of this, you might help me find some more information about this elusive Mr. Barrett. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gail, for the wonderful presentation. We have some questions coming in for you. We have a few minutes for questions.
I'm trying to open up the thing. Okay.
The first question we have is, I'm curious how Nathan Barrett found clients, or did they find him? Was his name shared among wealthy homeowners, or did he advertise?
He did get lots of referrals from friends, and he worked primarily with the help of architects. Architects would reference him all the time, and they liked working with him, or else they didn't. I'm not sure, but like he did work closely with them. So that's one way that he found clients. He was a very jovial kind of person, and you know, he made a lot of friends, and he belonged to different clubs like the Arts Club and things like that. So there were other ways that he could have made contacts.
Another question is, did Nathan Barrett have any specific trees or plants that he liked to use in his designs?
There are so many, but if I can't go back to the Magnolia Parkway planting, but I think he really liked those kinds of flowers. He liked the kind of hardy flowers that and in his garden. And I didn't have time to tell you all about his garden in the back of his house, which is a whole another long lecture. He combined old-fashioned flowers, and he combined exotic flowers. He put things together in his own house. Now, he wouldn't have done that for clients necessarily, because he wanted to do what they wanted, of course, but he was quite an eclectic approach to these things.
And you talked about his house in New York, but he was doing projects all over the country. And do you know, was it the kind of situation where he would go and look at the places he was going to be designing and then went home to do his plans and stayed at home when work was being done? Or was he more of a hands-on type that would stay in the location that he was working on?
He often went back home to do some of the plans after surveying everything. And that happened at the Peters Park, certainly. But he did travel a great deal, and he did stay for long periods of time. And perhaps that began when he was working for Pullman, because in order to plan that large community and plant, he really had to be there in the early days. So he rode trains quite a bit. Now, when he worked for Pullman, he probably got a pass on a Pullman car, but he also took trains, and I found his name on different trains going to the west. But his family must have been without him for long periods of time, I believe.
And someone asked, was Barrett athletic himself? He seemed to like athletics.
He definitely was. He definitely was. He spoke at one point about riding his little pony around Staten Island as a kid, right? That was his life. But I think he was also a rower, a water person. I think that's one of the reasons he wanted to create that athletic area for the Pullman town. And he in later years was more likely to be the referee rather than the participant, but he also got his children to get out there on the court and in Rochelle Park when they were having events there, and he would also participate in that old-fashioned game of tug of war, and all the manly men would be there on the court, I'm sure, and he would participate in that way.
Great, and I think we'll do 2 more questions. So his comment about California landscapes makes me think of the serious water issues in California and other parts of the West today. Do you think this was on his mind?
I don't know if he could have imagined what our climate is like today. But he did travel to many places, and he was really concerned about preservation all the time, but he was also worried about access that people would have to these sites. And I think that was very important to him. Now, that doesn't completely answer your question, but I just don't think that he would have thought particularly about the situation that we're in today.
Please describe his design ethic. Were his designs organic, more like the English garden, or more structured like the French garden? Or would he have put himself in a different category altogether?
He could be in many ways. He's very interested in the Italian style, I will say that. After traveling there, he came back and created lots of grottos in some places, but he also liked Dutch landscaping in a certain way. That by that I mean he liked putting plants in giant jars, right? And he really liked to mix things up. He was aware of all these different styles of landscaping, and he worked with them all, I would say.
Do you have a favorite garden of his that is open to the public?
I don't know quite how to answer that. I did really enjoy going to Rochelle Park, and one thing I'd really like to say is that Rochelle Park in Westchester County was one of the first places that desegregated, right?
Mm.
And it's very interesting that Rochelle Park has a large number of people of color living there, artists and architects and planners, I'm sure, but just like in the years that Barrett lived there. But that is an interesting place to go visit, and it's just off the highway.
Okay, and we have one final question to wrap up that kind of brings us to the modern day. It was interesting that Barrett was involved in the founding of the American Society of Landscape Architects and even opened a school in his own home. Do you know if he promoted the idea of landscape architect programs in colleges and universities?
Well, he's a little too old for that. So the younger people in the ASLA, did go to college to learn and to learn landscape planning skills. But Barrett, just like Olmsted Sr., never did that, right? And many of the first members of the ASLA were people who did this on their own, worked in as florist and things like that. So he wouldn't have imagined that perhaps at that time, but he wanted to have younger people be interested in landscape design for sure. He thinks it was really important.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Gail. And thank you to everyone who joined tonight and for your wonderful questions. And I think we'll pass it off to Susan for some closing remarks.
Oh, thank you, Gail. And thank you, Renata. I hope everybody found this program as fascinating as I did. Your memberships and generous donations help CCHS make programs such as this one. And I just want to thank you for your support and remind you to please be on the lookout for our membership letter. Good night and thank you.